Aloha Hawaii, this is Pokalai Nui. You are listening to Hawaiian Potpourri. Today is the first day of July, so we begin in the second half of this year, the year 2012. I am Pokalai Nui, and this is Hawaiian Potpourri. The time now is 8 minutes past the hour of 6 o'clock, and I had wanted to bring you up to date, or at least as far as I am up to date, on some of the news or some of the events occurring in the international arena. And we begin immediately with what is happening in Iraq. The United States is said to have pulled out of Iraq, although they still leave a very large contingent in Iraq as, quote, advisors. It seemed like a reversal of what happened in Vietnam. It started out with advisors, with an increase in troops following the initial advisor crew. In Iraq, instead, there was a complete invasion of that country, and following that, now we have advisors left in Iraq. Although the terms have changed, the reality is that they are still fighting military, and their roles may have changed temporarily. But that's about it. Anyway, they are left in Iraq. The news is that a half year after the U.S. military, quote, left Iraq, dire predictions seem to be coming true. The country is mired in violence, and the government is on the verge of collapse. With no relief in sight, there is growing talk of Iraq as a failed state, as Al-Qaeda's local wing staged near-daily attacks that killed at least 234 people in June. Iraq no longer suffers widespread retaliatory killings between Sunni and Shiite extremists, but brought the country to the brink of civil war. But the spike in violence heightens fears that Iraq could limp along for years as an unstable and dangerous country. June was the second deadliest month since U.S. troops withdrew from Iraq in mid-December, as insurgents exploited the political struggles between the country's ethnic and sectarian factions. More significant than the numbers was that the insurgents appeared able to sustain the level of violence over a longer period than usual. There was a major deadly bombing or shooting rampage almost every 3 days, many targeting Shiite pilgrims. The violence has brought the weakness of Iraq's security apparatus into sharp focus, even as deepening political divisions dim the prospects that the country will emerge as a stable democracy after decades of war and dictatorship. The state is almost paralyzed and dysfunctional due to political feuds. In such circumstances, the security forces also will be paralyzed, and the insurgent groups are making use of this chaos. Haldar al-Sadi, the Shiite owner of an internet cafe in eastern Baghdad, said Saturday, "I do not think that Al-Qaeda is getting any stronger. It is the state that is getting weaker." The situation deteriorated shortly after American troops left Iraq on December 18, after failed negotiations to stay beyond a year-end withdrawal deadline that was cemented in a 2008 security agreement. The next day, Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's government issued terror charges against Vice President Tariq al-Hashimi, one of Iraq's highest-ranking Sunnis, who fled Baghdad and remains on the lam. Sunni lawmakers briefly boycotted parliament and al-Maliki's cabinet in protest. By spring, leaders of the self-ruled Kurdish northern region joined the Sunni-dominated Iraqi political coalition against al-Maliki, whom they accused of refusing to share power. And last week, in the first major defection by an influential Shiite leader, anti-American cleric Muqtada al-Sadr said he would direct his followers to join efforts to oust al-Maliki if a power-sharing agreement is not reached. Government spokesman Ali al-Dabag agreed Saturday that the political crisis has fueled June's violent surge. The insurgents are making use of the political differences in the country, and the recent attacks are the results of this political strife, al-Dabag said. Okay, so we start an examination of Iraq from, let's say, 2001. The leadership in Iraq is none other than Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein had a very stable government. He was in complete control over his government. Some people say he was too dictatorial, and he was certainly not a democratic person. But he had control over the Sunni as well as over the Shiites. He brought in Christians as well, and so his government had incorporated people of different religions. There was a high level, well, prior to the American embargoes, there was high level of education. There was good electrical facilities, water facilities, waste sewer systems in Baghdad, and Iraq was a stable nation. It was through the intervention of the United States that started this instability of Iraq, leading up to an invasion and attack against a peaceful nation. Iraq was not antagonizing against the United States in any overt way that had legitimized the American invasion into Iraq. After all these years and years of destabilization of Iraq, the changing of the political system, and then the Americans finally leaving, looking at the pre-American invasion and involvement in Iraq and the post conditions of Iraq following Americans' departure or partial departure, what has the situation turned into? The country has been ruined. The people of Iraq are now in turmoil even among themselves. And so where is the responsibility for all of this? It is on the United States military, on the United States political system, and those who supported the invasion, the illegal invasion into Iraq. Okay? That's my opinion anyway, and I invite you to call us and share a contrary opinion should you have one. And I'm noticing that some of my recording instruments are not recording as it should be. So if you will bear with me, please. Just 1 minute. Okay, so anyway, that is a situation that we face in Iraq. Our telephone number here is 524-1080 should you wish to comment on my comments or add any other comments with regards to what's happening in Iraq. Now, since we're on this international view of what's happening in other countries, what about Afghanistan? Well, there seems to be a change for the positive in Afghanistan. The first article that I read came out of the Star Advertiser at, let me find it, it was at page A3, written by, from the Associated Press. There was no writer attributed to that article. The next article comes from the Star Advertiser, and this is at page A5, dealing with the Taliban. Taliban and Afghan envoys meet at a peace conference. Now, this is something new because previously the Taliban was saying no sense meeting with the Afghan government because they are merely puppets. The ones who really control the Afghan government is the United States, and so our meeting should be with the U.S. Hillary Clinton had, while saying they would not be meeting with the Taliban, have actually been conducting secret negotiations with the Taliban, and now we see that the Taliban is in fact meeting with the Afghan government officials. A Taliban, and now I'm reading, and this news comes out of Japan, Kyoto. A Taliban emissary sat face-to-face last week with a senior Afghan government official responsible for peace talks in a rare high-level gathering between the bitter adversaries, an official said Saturday. The encounter at a peace and reconciliation conference in Kyoto, Japan, was a rare positive sign in faltering attempts to build a peaceful end to the protracted conflict in Afghanistan. It also provided an unusual chance for Afghan President Hamid Karzai's government to sit down with its enemies, the Taliban, and the Hezbi Islami insurgent group. Sadiq Mansour Ansari, a peace activist who was invited to attend the meeting at Kyoto's Doshisha University, said it was the third peace and reconciliation conference organized by the school, but the first time the Taliban had sent an emissary. The Taliban's former planning minister, Qadi Din Mohammed Hanif, took part in a conference, quote, to explain the policies of the Islamic Emirate. Taliban spokesman Zabihullah Mujahid said by telephone. The Afghan government was represented by Mohammed Masood Stanikzai, a senior member of the government's High Peace Council, which is responsible for talks with the insurgency. Ansari said the conference was not intended to find a peace settlement, but to air ideas and differences. Karzai and U.S. officials are trying to draw the Taliban back to talks on a peace deal between the Afghan government and the Pashtun-based insurgency that would end a war that U.S. commanders say cannot be won with military power alone. The Taliban have refused to negotiate with the Karzai government, saying the U.S. holds the effective control in Afghanistan. So we are seeing some changes there. At least the Taliban did attend this peace and reconciliation conference to explain its position. So I would suggest that that's a positive move forward in what's happening there in Afghanistan. So there you have it for Afghanistan and what's happening in Iraq. Of course, Syria continues to be a major problem in that region of the world, and in that particular situation, the United States has been involved in the creating what has now been called a civil war in Syria, and the U.S. involvement was through the CIA involvement in starting up this protest against the Syrian government. The Syrian government responded like it appears any other government would, and that is that when there is a rebellion against the government responds by shutting down the rebellion. In this case, those who rebelled against the government rebelled with arms, very forcefully rebelled, and the Syrian government responded just as forcefully or even more forcefully. There is some debate about the Syrian government shouldn't have used planes and tanks because the rebellion did not, or the rebels did not have planes and tanks to defend them. Sure they didn't, because they couldn't accumulate that equality of armament as the government had. And the government, of course, had been building up its armament, even with the, not the possibility, but with the capability of downing a jet fighter that came across or came close to its borders from Turkey. So the Syrian government is not a government that is incapable of protecting itself, even against its own people who may rebel against the government. And the government did respond in that way and continues to respond in that way. Now the American government is saying, hey, this is inhumane, and we shouldn't allow the Syrian government to attack its own people and kill using these high-powered weaponry. And so the American government is trying to get the other communities, the European community and the the community in this particular Middle East region of the world to respond and take an active role in stopping the Syrian government from doing what it's doing to its people. The Chinese and the Russians are, of course, saying, hey, hold off, let's stop this kind of invasiveness into the territorial integrity of another independent country. And because of this, the situation in Syria keeps fomenting. On one side, more support is being given to the rebels. On the other side, no one is able to step in and stop the Syrian government from its suppression of its rebellion. The United States is saying that this is an inhumanitarian thing to allow, and yet it is that very government that is sponsoring the kind of civil disobedience and civil war that is going on in Syria. So the question is, who is the protagonist of all of this? And is not the protagonist the one to be viewed as the cause of this problem? And here you go, the hand comes right back to the U.S. government. There may be others beside the U.S. government also pushing the envelope, but the U.S. government certainly is involved in that area. The summit, which results in a Syrian transition plan, or which was hopefully to result in the Syrian transition plan, met in Geneva, Switzerland. And this is out of the New York Times. Major world powers failed to reach a consensus Saturday on calling for the removal of Syrian President Bashar Assad, agreeing instead on a plan for a political transition that seemed to have little chance of implementation. The meeting of 9 nations in Geneva to try to end the bloodshed in Syria ended in a now familiar division, with Russia and China blocking the rest from calling for Assad's ouster. Kofi Annan, the UN and Arab League mediator who convened the action group, tried to put the best possible spin on the agreement, which calls for the formation of a national unity government that would oversee the drafting of a new constitution and elections. The agreement, he said, provided, quote, a perspective for the future that can be shared by all in Syria, a genuinely democratic and pluralistic state. But it appeared to lack support from either side of the conflict. The pro-government Ba'athist Party analyst in Damascus, who spoke on the condition of anonymity, said the Assad government had its own plan for political transition that previously scheduled presidential elections in 2014. This is the only way to solve the country's crisis, he said. Syria is a one-party state, and its elections are widely viewed as neither free nor fair. The diplomatic developments were marked by another particularly bloody day in Syria, including the deaths of dozens of civilians caught in shelling. The worst bloodshed took place at a funeral Saturday for an opposition activist in Damascus, etc., etc. Okay, so anyway, that's what the scenario is. Now, Kofi Annan is trying to broker a deal with no one interested in Kofi Annan's deal. So, what's going to happen in Syria? Well, there's going to continue to be this civil disobedience. The government will continue to try to put down the civil disobedience, and unless you have an intervention by outside forces, essentially the government will win. What kind of outside forces will intervene? Well, the various parties, including the United States, will continue to send in supplies to support the rebels, which is contrary to international law, because there is a very clear claim that Syria is in civil war, and therefore all countries are supposed to stay out, recognizing the sovereign integrity of Syria. So all countries are supposed to stay out, but it's questionable whether or not this will actually happen. All right, if you have any questions, any comments to make, our telephone number here is 524-1080.
Kaulana na pua o Hawaii, kupa ama hope o ka aina, iki mai ka elele o ka loko ino, pala pala anunu me ka paka. Pane mai Hawaii moku o ke ave, koku ana